part of the Theory and History course for students in the M1 year. We're privileged to have with us Jean-pierre de one of the foremost thinkers in architecture in the Southern African region. He is also editor of Domus Africa, which is the bureau of Domus International, covering design on the African continent. This evening he will be presenting one of the key debates in French philosophy between Jean-Paul Sartre and Claude Lèvi-Strauss. This is the first of 3 lectures on French philosophy that Jean-Pierre will be presenting. I introduce you to Jean-Pierre de Laporte.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Patricia, and welcome to you all. First, I'd like to ask you, is the PA necessary, or is it? Okay. Well, if it gets a bit much, just say so. The format of tonight's presentation is I will spend an hour establishing the position of Sartre, then we'll take a break, drink, smoke, and then I will lay out the position of Lèvi-Strauss, and we will look at the debate. My aim in accepting this kind invitation to speak at your school was not to provide some additional dimension to your academic curriculum, but to look at these debates from a point of view in the present, I think in the South African present, but also to some extent in the global present, where the relevance of all of these debates and all of these thinkers' positions has become far more acute. We all read things and understand things from the needs of the present. I think that certain of the needs in the present echo very strongly with the 6 thinkers that we will deal with over the coming 3 events. So I am not assuming familiarity with the works of the thinkers that we discuss, but I would like you to indulge me. I cannot lay out the content of Sartre's gigantic 1,000-page book in an hour. I wish I could. So I will go to themes and motifs that I hope will encourage you to read these works and orientate your reading. They're very simple to read. They are not garbled. And when you do read them, I'd like you to always keep in mind that they were written in a particular moment, and that this moment really has got many of the characteristics of the situation that you find yourselves in. Not the situation you find yourselves in academically, but the situation you find yourselves in as professionals, as thinkers, as citizens, as people. My reason for choosing debates is because I have the belief that that very interesting period in French thought, say from 1960 until 1980, can be best characterized by looking at 3 debates between 6 thinkers. This is not, of course, to diminish the importance of dozens of other thinkers and writers at that time, but simply to find the points where the most acute disputes became formulated. And as a result of these disputes, the entire climate of thought and debate and inquiry somewhat reorientated itself. So you could say that we are looking at a situation of the 3 key reorientations in French thought at that time. And you might ask why only 3, because after the last one, I think the game changed fundamentally. And if we have time in the last session, I will perhaps try to sketch where some of the legacy or some of the issues raised by these three successions are today, where they have been picked up and what they have engendered. Are you all good with the sound? Our CIC camera crew is here to put this occasion on YouTube. It'll probably be about the 10 millionth posting on YouTube for today. So I'd like to thank Freddie and Leo for their good work and their hasty setup. Okay. Sartre is absolutely not a professor. He is what you might think of as a private thinker. I think he would have rejected the term intellectual as too grand. And it's important to realize that he adopted this stance of remaining somewhat aloof from the academy and from all other institutions very deliberately. Sartre's name is always associated with existentialism. And at one time, I guess, an audience of your age would have needed no introduction to existentialism. We would have been eager to show what existentialists you were. But that time was maybe 40 years ago. And it's intriguing to look today at what existentialism gave to Sartre and why it was really quite pivotal in the development of his position and also of his fame. To do that, let's take a quick excursion into the 19th century and look at the person who commonly creates in a very ingenious and very subversive way this philosophical position known as existentialist, and that is a Danish writer, Søren Kierkegaard, who took it upon himself in the 1840s to take down a thinker who was probably the intellectual celebrity of the day, and that is Georg Hegel. So you have this extraordinary professorial, encyclopedic, absolute celebrity, Hegel in Berlin, absolutely the professor. He has an opinion on everything within his subject. And you have this Danish guy, considered very eccentric in his small town. He has a small trust fund, so he's able to devote himself to writing and to literary matters. But he takes it upon himself to enter this David versus Goliath content of taking Hegel down. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on Hegel. I think you can access many good concordances of Hegel's thought, particularly today when Zizek is extremely powerful exegete of Hegel and has made Hegel into something very current today. But roughly, Hegel comes at a point in European history when the Germans are wondering why they haven't had a revolution like the Americans or the French, and they're looking very deeply into the potentials of their culture to change, to achieve autonomy, to achieve independence, to cast off the last remnants of tyranny and fragmentation, feudal fragmentation, and so on. So Hegel is somebody who wishes to look extremely deeply into his cultural and political present, where he sees, of course, conflicts, the way in which we would if we looked around ourselves today and we saw, if we sat and enumerated the huge number of conflicts that are playing themselves out right now, people counting ballots, people denouncing each other in Parliament, the press being thrown out because they have telephoto lenses and so on and so forth. Hegel has conflicts of a similar kind. But he brings an insistence that these conflicts are constructive. So even though you might undergo some very real suffering, you might undergo invasion, you might undergo loss, etc., Hegel finds a very ingenious way of construing these things as having a historical rationale, as being in some very fundamental sense constructive, even if they are not felt or seen as constructive by those who participate in them, by those who bring them about. And so there is, in Hegel's view, not exactly an optimistic account of history and experience, but there is a sense that nothing is lost in the realm of culture. It can always be redeemed at some later point by a concept, by interpretation, and that therefore it can become part of a culture's instruments for going forward, even though you stumbled into it by accident. Now, Kierkegaard finds this extraordinarily offensive notion because Kierkegaard says that if Hegel had constructed this system, which is an ingenious, very brilliant system, and then said as his last sentence, but it's all a thought experiment, then he would say Hegel's the greatest speculative thinker in the world. But Hegel doesn't say it's all a thought experiment. He says this is the way things are, and therefore Kierkegaard says Hegel is the biggest buffoon in the world for thinking this. So this malicious, ingenious Kierkegaard sets about opposing to Hegel's system of history, conflict, meaning, experience, opposing to it all those things which escape it, which happen to us, but which don't get caught up or redeemed or captured in a concept which happen to us, but which are in fact hardly even thinkable. But there are things which we must undergo, and hence the idea of existential, because there are things which are lived through, but they are unthinkable. They do not yield to being clarified by discussion, by argument, by concept, by science, by anything. So living and dying, the fact that you are born at a time not of your choosing, you are absolutely certainly going to die, you cannot subcontract your dying to someone else, etc. There are certain unavoidable things which are absolutely opaque, but they are part of the adventure of being yourself. And Kierkegaard writes about these things, highlights these things as precisely what is unassimilable to Hegel's system of rationalizing events, and hence capturing the sense of events in a broader subsequent history. Kierkegaard is an ingenious writer on the borderline of philosophy and fiction. He creates 12 or more pseudonyms for himself to represent all these different positions. He pretends that these are not his writings. He pretends these are manuscripts that he found in a drawer and so on and so forth. So a number of very ingenious romantic literary devices by which he sneaks in the concrete experience and the paradoxes of concrete experience into the mainstream of philosophy, mainly to be used against Hegel. Now, as Sartre points out, one cannot compare Kierkegaard to Hegel as philosophers. Hegel certainly overpowers Kierkegaard, but one cannot simply dismiss the strategy or the points raised by Kierkegaard. And it so happens that Kierkegaard's legacy, without its necessarily anti-Hegelian bias, becomes powerfully revived at a point much later in the 19th century, in fact in the early 20th century, when a group of philosophers, this time professors, under Edmund Husserl, who puts forward a program of research, a systematic program of research for philosophy that he calls phenomenology, because he wants to adhere strictly to phenomena, to the way things appear to us, to consciousness. Husserl puts this firmly on the agenda in order, I suppose, to to combat some of the encroachment of the sciences at that time, to deal with issues similar to the issues today, where people would say, why deal with thought? Why deal with experience? Why not leave that to brain science? Why not leave that to cognitive science? Why not leave it to neuroscience, etc., etc.? And Husserl's response to that is that all of these sciences extract their object, to identify their object from experience. What is fundamental to the access to the object of science, of the various particular sciences, including the notion of your brain and the notion of investigating your brain and so on. Where do you access your brain? You access your brain as part of your consciousness, as part of your awareness, etc. And then you construct something on the basis of that, working on neurons and impulses and so on and so forth as an extension. So you can see that phenomenology as a systematic movement in philosophy aimed at establishing the primacy of consciousness. And it was able to do this without falling into the idea of a purely private universe or an absolutely subjective universe. Because in Husserl's view, consciousness had a very particular characteristic. What is essential to consciousness is that it is always consciousness of something. There is no consciousness of consciousness. Consciousness, wherever we encounter it, is always read off something which is not consciousness. And this Husserl names by the medieval logical concept of intentionality. It has little to do with intention in the common sense term, but intentionality simply means that consciousness is always encountered. We get a hold of consciousness, we know consciousness, we have consciousness, only because it is essentially and always consciousness of something, even if it's consciousness of pink unicorns in the middle of a dream. You will always find that it retains this essentially intentional structure. Now, Husserl's most important follower in this program was, of course, Martin Heidegger. And it is through Heidegger that we see the reintroduction, the very creative reintroduction of Kierkegaard, of existentialism, into this rather scientific, rather staid, but very interesting program of phenomenology. And Heidegger's point simply builds on Husserl's point that if consciousness is always consciousness of something, then consciousness is radically open. It's like an exposed wound. Your consciousness, you could say, is absolutely raw on one end. You have no control whatsoever over what your consciousness is conscious of. It simply is pouring experience at you and pouring structure at itself. And so Heidegger investigates the fact that we are radically open to experience and radically open to chance and to the world, simply by virtue of being conscious. That our consciousness, in a way, is like a permanent hemorrhage within our experience, rather than something comforting, romantic, private, that can be closed off. We are always, says Heidegger, gewerf, we are thrown into the world. We don't find ourselves like gently introduced into the world. We might tell ourselves that we are, but we always find ourselves thrown into the world at a particularly inconvenient time, with particularly inconvenient parents, in a particularly inconvenient country, with particularly inconvenient institutions. But these complaints are just elaborations of the fact that fundamentally we as conscious beings, as self-aware beings, have as our starting point the fact of thrownness. These are all aspects of being thrown. These are all consequences of being thrown. And Heidegger, in his culminating in his 1927 book, Being and Time, Silent Zeit, diabolically, ingeniously explores the structure of our awareness in terms of this openness, not a very pleasant openness. Hence he will say the fundamental structure of human Dasein, which is a compound word in German, means being there. The fundamental structure of being here is being towards death. So if you are not aware of the fact that this is a very finite gig and you're heading inevitably towards death, you cannot grasp your consciousness or the nature of your being there. Authentically, you probably hiding the fact, or you don't know how to conceive of the fact. And even if we know nothing of death, and even if we can't even think death as living creatures, if it's an inconceivable event to the living, it still remains the fact that we are fundamentally orientated towards death. So the final dramatic point in Heidegger's Silent Zeit that sets up the scene for Sartre's early work is his conception of time. And Heidegger's conception of time is not some unifying thing in which an individual can sort of have a legacy, come to fruition, etc., etc. It's something absolutely split in three directions. It goes beyond the present into the past in a very indecisive way. It goes beyond the present into the future in a way that's very opaque. And the present itself is split, is constantly being divided or further cut open into the past and into the present. So time becomes one of the principles by which we become, for Heidegger, opaque to ourselves rather than more available or transparent or familiar to ourselves. Right. Where does all this lead? Sartre finds himself as a young student of philosophy in the 1920s. He finds himself rather bored, or at least jaded, towards the current academic debates in philosophy of his time. And really, who could blame him? And he then finds what really would have been extremely new, extremely radical and provocative at that time. It would be the equivalent of your coming across Sloterdijk or Zizek. So he finds thinkers who are not of the mainstream, and that is, of course, Husserl and Heidegger. And interestingly, he wins a prize or some sort of scholarship or other to go to the French Institute in Berlin in 1933, of all years. So here is this guy wanting to encounter very radical, completely new form of thought in Germany at exactly the point at which Germany is intensifying its project of National Socialism. And he's sitting in this little institute and he's reading the manuscripts of Husserl because very little is published. Husserl, being Jewish, then found himself cut off from academic publication and even from academic job. Heidegger, who is this enormously progressive, audacious thinker, by that time has accepted a job with the Nazis as a rector of a university, so Sartre finds himself really the recipient of quite a prickly legacy, a legacy that he can't simply use because to some sense with Heidegger has already sort of truncated Husserl's thought by radicalizing it. So he's in a way like overtaken Husserl's projects in Husserl's own terms. So he's in a way hijacked phenomenology. He's taken them to a very radical extreme, but he himself now finds himself a kind of activist within the Nazi project. Sartre goes back to France. The Nazis invade France, as you know, from millions of movies on TV, and he's conscripted into the army, and of course the French army capitulates, so he finds himself in a German prison of war camp for 9 months or so, uncertain of whether he'll be released or what is happening. And in this situation, he decides to really get down to study Heidegger. And it would take about 9 months and no distractions like that in order to get to grips with Heidegger, I guess. And in response, this is the interesting point, in direct response not only to his interesting circumstance, but in response to his reading of Heidegger, he immediately sets about writing his own account, almost overwriting on Heidegger's being and time. So Sartre sets out to write what he calls being and nothingness. And being and nothingness, I think, is the first large systematic work that defines Sartre on the scene. But you must imagine at that time of writing, there is no scene. He's in a prisoner of war camp. Germans have invaded his country. He's in the position of somebody in Iraq today. He doesn't have any idea whether there'll be a country, whether such a thing as philosophy would be welcomed under a new regime, etc. But nevertheless, he persists because his level of engagement, his level of commitment to this work is so powerful that even under these circumstances, he starts writing Being and Nothingness, which he subtitles an ontology, a phenomenological ontology. What does this mean? Well, apart from squarely positioning himself in the succession of Husserl and Heidegger, he means that he's not interested in knowledge. He's not interested in what phenomenology can reveal to him about morality or about aesthetics or about anything else. He's interested in what phenomenology can reveal about being. Now, you might say that being is a very elusive subject, and indeed it is. But it is Heidegger's point that Sartre takes up as well, that even though we might find it difficult to gain access to the being of things in the world, we don't understand ants, we don't understand swallow migrations, we don't understand a lot of chemistry, we don't understand our friends, we don't understand too much about chairs and tables, but we can have access to one particular being, and that is ourselves. The real question for Heidegger, as much as Sartre in this work, is how reliable is that access? And if we do make this access, what does it reveal? Where does it put us? Well, I think first and foremost, Sartre works the notion of intentionality, the intentional structure of consciousness, very hard. And he comes to the striking and quite accurate conclusion that if consciousness is always structured as consciousness of something, then there is no way in which we can dig around in consciousness to find the ego or the self, or the I. So no matter how you probe consciousness, whether you're an artist or you probe it with drugs or you probe it with conversation, we probe it with the sincerity of your friends, you probe it with sadomasochism, you probe it with whatever you like, you are not going to find in it anything like an ego or an I or a self, because it is not that kind of thing. However, insofar as you have access or experience of or an acquaintance with an ego or a self or an I, it is an object of consciousness. So consciousness is always beside, to some extent, the self or the ego or the I. So the ego is always has its origin, or the I or the self has its origin outside consciousness, as an object of consciousness, which is somehow assumed. Now, this puts paid to the kind of argument which could say, well, even if my consciousness is not such a reliable source, I am fundamentally what Richard Dawkins says I am, a mammal. I evolved, I have neurons, I have cells, I have hormones, I have whatever it is. I'm the object of a number of natural and human sciences and so on and so forth. And Sartre will characterize this object of our experience where we see ourselves as completely naturalistic and think we can investigate ourselves naturalistically as an object of science. He will see that as a particular mode of being of the human, which he calls being in itself. So all those aspects of you which you share in common with a sack of potatoes, if you both fall out an upstairs window, you'll hit the ground quite hard. You are subject to gravity. You can cut your leg off the way you can cut a branch off, etc. These are all aspects of your being in terms of a being in itself. We are natural creatures. No one is crazy enough to argue that we're not. We evolved, or whether we evolved or not, it's neither here nor there. What is important for Sartre is the other aspect of our being, which happens simultaneously, and that is the fact that we can be being for ourselves, as he calls it. So it's not just what we are, how we find ourselves intrinsically, tall, short, ugly, young, old, etc. That is quite secondary to the fact that our consciousness never coincides with that entirely. We have to some extent, fool ourselves in order to believe that our consciousness is the consciousness, simply the direct expression of this physico-chemical, neuroplastic, evolved, cognitive, whatever it is, blah, blah thing. So it is here that Sartre's view in being and nothingness becomes very interesting and very radical, because the consequence of this non-coincidence between being in itself and being for itself is that being for itself finds nothing to lock onto, even though you're condemned to being conscious that way. When you think of yourself, when you are conscious in a way for yourself. You are trying to formulate yourself. And here Sartre's work becomes very interesting, very paradoxical, very diabolical. You're clearly in line to Kierkegaard, who's also trying to evade a facile answer to these kinds of questions. And he says, you really cannot answer the question of what you are for yourself by saying, well, I am just an animal, or I am just a pure spirit, or I am a waiter, or I am a Republican, or I am a factory worker, or I am a staunch EFF supporter. Because there too, you are treating those roles, which are part of the in itself, as if they were the nature of the for itself. And no sooner have you entered into those roles enthusiastically and sincerely when you find your consciousness exceeds them. So being split, this ontological, this way of being of humans, being split in these two ways, means that you have to constantly choose between performing a role. But while you're performing a role, you must be aware that you cannot become that thing you're performing, even though you are performing it very, very well. And if you cease to perform it, you are not thrown back on some big, long, epic story of your experience where all the roles you have performed add up somehow. That would be sort of Hegel's take on the whole thing. You are simply thrown back on the instability of the nothingness of your consciousness. It is free because it is nothing. It can deceive itself, and Sartre talks about bad faith or self-deceit, into believing that it is just this thing. But humans cannot be anything in the way in which a stone is a stone, he says, or a tree. We are constantly dealing with this flow of this lack of being, this nothingness in his title, that characterizes our experience of ourselves. And no matter what we do, it doesn't go away. So we are creatures for whom our being is always in question. Hence, we're able to embark on projects such as Kierkegaard's or Heidegger's or Sartre's, because we are essentially creatures who are ontologically unstable. And we have to formulate ourselves in a project. But we know that the project isn't going to give us a 100% answer. And we know that the project is simply going to define a situation, as he calls it. In other words, if my project is to become the best pianist in the world, then obviously the situation I will start to develop around that project is an awareness of other pianists, piano competitions, practicing 8 hours a day, etc., etc., etc. So in a sense, you create a stage set in which you can formulate yourself as a project. But if you are not in a state of bad faith or self-deceit, you realize that you cannot totally become the object of that project. And so in a state of anxiety or in a state of awareness, that you cannot be anything absolutely, but you have to constantly enact instead. A number of dilemmas of an interpersonal kind arise, according to Sartre. So he has some very striking and very entertaining and very brilliantly written pages on such matters as being in love. Why would anyone want to be in love? Obviously, given his thoughts on the in itself, not because of some hormonal or evolved or whatever it is disposition in an organism, but obviously because you want somebody else to provide you with a sense of being that you lack. So you would want to idealize or perfect or create a mirror for yourself in the other person. And of course, Sartre, with his very witty way of exploring situations, says that in using another person as a mirror, inevitably you need to control them, and you need to make sure that they always have you in their sights. And so this makes in love this mirror-to-mirror relationship not some great harmony of having found your other half. It makes it into sadomasochistic manipulation of the one lover by the other. And then he says something similar about sex, where he says, here there is also a somewhat deluded belief that you can reduce the other to a pure in itself by putting them into a state of desire, evoking their body, dealing only with their body, relating to their body by your body, etc. In other words, you're escaping in that situation from the instability, from the nothingness of the being for itself, in order to try and concretize in this moment of two bodies a kind of absolute concrete presence, a becoming on the level absolutely of the given. So desire is almost an attempt to translate yourself from the situation of ontological nullity into a situation where with the other you have become a body and an object of their desire as a body and their bodily experience and so on and so forth. But Sartre wittily says that sex is like skiing, and then you get to the bottom of the slope and then there's like nothing. Because fortunately, fortunately, otherwise who knows where this would end, right? So these and other things we don't have time to go into, but I think I've said enough to suggest to you that you should read Sartre's Being a Nothingness. It's an extraordinary book, and I'm sure you know that Sartre also brought many of these points home in his role as a novelist and a playwright. He was an exceptional novelist and playwright. And those of you who've read his 1938 novel entitled Nausea, it's nausea. His hero has nausea looking at the roots of a tree and just sees the sheer fact of being, and that being is completely empty and gratuitous. Creates a sense of complete nausea at his own existence. Am I here just to witness this nothingness? And whatever meaning do I have to make it up? And I know I'm making it up, but I've got no option but to make it up, and so on. He lays out very brilliantly in his novel the themes that he would then, of course, detail philosophically in Being a Nothingness. And that, in a way, goes back, is in a sense a homage to Kierkegaard, who so fluently mixes existential exploration and the devices of fiction and authorship. But this is not the book of Sartre that I want to talk about. So, to some extent, you are misled. But it is very important to understand his starting point, because given what we've said about the the nothingness of human being, and the way it impels us to undertake projects, to try and fill this, to try and define this, and so on. And also given the ultimate futility of these projects, even though we must undertake them or we would be probably worse off, you can see that it could be quite difficult in this realm of futility and sadomasochism and unintended consequences and so on, of unsustainability of identity, to imagine a social philosophy or imagine a political philosophy. You know, would people just sit around and basically bail out? But if they bail out, they are seized with anxiety at their own nothingness. But I mean, the kind of creature that is elaborated in the phenomenological ontology of Sartre doesn't easily lend itself to translation into something political. And of course, Sartre is aware of this, and he's aware that in having so brilliantly endorsed and extended Kierkegaard, he has left out the other great precursor, which is, of course, Hegel, who is, if anything, purely historical and political in his thinking. And so Sartre decides to elaborate a political philosophy compatible with his view of freedom, the fact that we are condemned to freedom by our nothingness. And his political philosophy has as one of its many aims the wish to understand what kind of process, what kind of broadly institution, what kind of society can safeguard and augment freedom. Or is it inevitably the case that humans are susceptible to conformity, manipulation, prescription, becoming lost in one another's identities and so on, because of our extreme fragility, the fragility of our identities? Are we destined to become on the social and political plane scared or timid conformists? And of course, Sartre's interest at that time is in the possibility of dramatic revolutionary social change, extensive social change. You can imagine that when he is writing Being in Nothingness, a prisoner of the Germans, a prisoner of the invaders, he can quite unproblematically defend the choice of freedom as his theme. Freedom's the most obvious thing in everyone's mind. What is the form of freedom? How do we possess freedom, etc.? How do we lose freedom in situations of occupation and invasion? And of course, after 1945, the French society liberated are the good guys. But by the time he starts writing the sketches for the Critique of Dialectical Reason, which is the book we talk about tonight, things have changed dramatically in France. France is at war with Algeria, which is one of the colonies it has invaded in North Africa. Suddenly, the French are the perpetrators of non-freedom. They are the oppressors. And so he's not living in a society where he can just simply endorse the return of freedom. He's looking at a society which seems to base a lot of its prosperity and its own satisfaction with itself on the denial of freedom to others, particularly those who's colonized. So when he starts writing this book, he's writing it from a very, very different perspective. And to Sartre's great credit, he brings the notion of colonized people and of colonials into focus as one of the greatest forms of oppression on earth at that time, and still. And he doesn't separate out the doings of Europe or the politics of Europe from the struggles all over the globe at that time. And it is in this context, of course, that Sartre becomes a very encouraging matrix, if you like, to Frantz Fanon. And as you know, Sartre writes a very interesting preface to one of Fanon's books, The Wretched of the Earth. But we're not here to talk about Fanon, although I think those who talk about Fanon and have not read Sartre are probably going to have a very difficult time. Well, it wouldn't stop them making up Fanon. But I'd like to simply introduce the critique of dialectical reason, what it means to put forward in philosophical terms the ambition of writing a critique, what the specific weight is of that. You've seen what the ambition of writing an ontology is, an inquiry into a mode of being, of a particular being, for Sartre in his first great book. In the second book, it's now a critique that's become his objective. And why a critique of dialectical reason? Why dialectical and why reason? If we remember that Sartre was not an academic, he didn't get sweets and prizes for publishing papers and adding to his tourism fund or whatever, his research fund or whatever, that he's writing as an engaged figure. He's the editor of a very influential magazine. It's not a journal. A journal is like, I don't know what a journal is for a handful of people, but he's an editor of a very important forum of ideas, very important novels. People who write the Nouveau Roman appear in his pages. Claude Lévi-Strauss, in fact, appears in his pages, favorably reviewed. Everybody who's anybody appears in this magazine called Temps Moderne, Modern Times, in honor of Charlie Chaplin's movie called Modern Times. And Sartre produced this magazine. Upstairs and below stairs was a cafe, and then he would have his meetings, and they'd go up, and everything would be laid out on a huge table, and so on and so forth. So it was a really, very sort of celebrated, important publication aimed at what was going on in the present. So when Sartre decides to write either a play or a novel or an essay, it is not a contribution to some interpretation of other philosophers or part of a curriculum or something like that. It is an intervention in a political situation, and hence everything he writes is shaped, of course, by the situation that he is intervening in. He, as a philosopher who expands and wonderfully develops this notion of situation, of this entanglement in his first book. And of course, as we've said, the situation there is the possibility of a revolutionary change in society. And in order to arrive at the instrument of this change, he has to almost backtrack to find it, because the 1950s are not a particularly revolutionary period. You can understand that this is the time of the Soviet invasion of Hungary, in other words, the Soviet Communist Party, which had put itself forward as the result of and as the prolongation of revolution on the Russian national scale and on the world front at that time, was appearing as more and more oppressive. It was the time of Khrushchev and the de-Stalinization, and one never really knew whether this was a real reform of the Communist Party, whether it would become a kind of instrument leading world revolution or change, or whether it was just cosmetic. Very similar to the problems that we are, in fact, speculating on tonight, I'm sure, in this room. And Sartre could not simply say, well, revolutionary change equals the left, equals the Communist Party, because at that time the left had entered into a very paradoxical situation. So he has to some extent, retrieve it. And interestingly, his philosophical strategy is to start talking about epochs, and I think this is quite an important thing for us. He says that a philosophy, and his two examples are Descartes and Kant, and then finally Marx. He says that a philosophy, when it appears in an era, cannot be surpassed until all of its consequences have been absorbed and exhausted and played out on the level of practice. So you will remain Cartesian. The early bourgeoisie, with their interest in science, conquest of nature, definition of the individual, etc., will take the coordinates of Descartes' thought and explore these things institutionally, artistically, morally, individually, etc., until, in fact, they are thoroughly chewed out like chewing gum, at which point there is room for another philosophical formulation. In this case, Kant. Kant will say in his three famous critiques, what can we know, what should we do, what can we experience, right? And experience in such a way that we can make sense of it, talk about it, etc. So in Kant's three critiques, you have the idea that the natural sciences are based on a certain way of representing matters or modeling matters, that moral behavior, our relation to duty, is based on a certain way of representing and therefore assimilating our laws and obligations. And you have the discussion of aesthetics, of the way experience reflects on itself and the ways in which that is an intelligible enterprise, in other words, the way in which experience can represent itself for Kant, and the ways in which it's a futile enterprise. So with Kant, says Sartre, you've reached the limit, if you like, of an inquiry into how we can represent, how we can make an image of ourselves, how we can make a model of ourselves, how we can make a concept of ourselves. But his claim is that Kant is exhausted and has been, in a sense, superseded. And interestingly, here he does not take Hegel as very distinct from Kant. He sees Hegel as a kind of late blooming or extreme radicalization of Kant, of representational way of thinking. But he erects Marx as the philosopher of the current epoch. And for Sartre, this means that any thought which deviates from Marx is in fact a return to pre-Marx. So any differing from Marx, in fact, constitutes a return to Kant or return to Descartes. He then adds, interestingly, that Marx's thought is extremely young, almost undeveloped. So even though it has the ability to cut off the era of representation, it nevertheless in itself is an embryonic project. And therefore, he sees his own role, and of course, I suppose the role of the previous Marxists whom he criticizes, as that of developing Marxism, of bringing it to, in fact, something of its full potential, rather than recovering it and restoring it, which would have been, say, the view of Adorno or Benjamin or the Frankfurt School, who felt that Marxism was really fully elaborated in the Russian Revolution, but in fact blew it, in fact missed its moment. And therefore they pessimistically have to go on in the wake of the failure of Marxism. Sartre's view is very different, that in fact Marxism has, in some sense, hardly begun to unfold. And what he sees as characteristic of Marxism is that it wishes to create institutions that are able to defend and safeguard and in a way augment human freedom. Remember, for Sartre, human freedom is not a choice. Human freedom is something we are condemned to by the very structure of ourselves and our awareness. So human freedom is not something you can dispense and say we'll put up with some sort of regime and be comfortable because we've sort of left our freedom at the door. So it's impossible to do such thing. But on the other hand, he also says that Marxism is called into existence by the fact that there is widespread scarcity. The sheer fact of scarcity guarantees that humans are in competition and hence in conflict. So between the requirement that a society should accommodate and in a way extend and make productive use of freedom at a level beyond the individual, and within the constraint that any such endeavor is held in check by scarcity, by the fact that nature cannot supply us with what we need, guarantees that such projects unfold in a state of conflict. It's interesting today when you see all over the Facebook little charts that say if every country in the world consumed energy in the way Australia did, then we would need like 4.5 worlds to accommodate Australia or America or whatever, and then some very good country like only needs half a world. But the fact is, I think we have discovered this problem of scarcity very strongly in the present, and we don't regard it simply as human-induced scarcity as a result of imperialist greed or exploitation. We regard it as a structural characteristic that the earth is not big enough to accommodate our use of it, that our use of the earth would require maybe 4 or 5 earths in order to overcome scarcity. So it is against this background of scarcity that Sartre's argument interestingly unfolds, and I think has a very strong relevance to the present. Scarcity is not the result of some global capitalist conspiracy, although that doesn't, hurt. But it is something which has to be in a concerted way, not in an individual way, in an absolutely concerted way, in a programmatic way, addressed. And those of you who follow Zizek's and Badiou's interesting retrievals of communism will see that what preoccupies them there is the need for some kind of consensual management of the common good, of the fact that humans, no matter who they are going to run up against extraordinary scarcity, and that they will either end up in a kind of gulag casino or they will sort of live off the planet somewhere, in a luxurious spaceship and charge you rental for breathing air. So Sartre's view is not dated. It's not a reaction to the time, to the extent to which, say, the views of the Frankfurt School and also at that time of Georgi Lukács are reactions to the history of the time. He wants to, in fact, have an ontology of history, an ontology of radical change, and understand the human potential for doing it. So the idea of a dialectic is that for Sartre there is a specific logic, there is a specific way of engaging process and history, and that all groups, in fact, throw this dialectical bridge into the future or into the present situation and probe it by means of this way of thinking and acting. It's a way of uniting thinking and acting in such a way that the limitations of pure thinking, pure reflection are overcome, and that, of course, the blindness of pure action is overcome as well. And Sartre spends a huge amount of massive intelligence elaborating what he sees as a specifically dialectical reason, allowing humans to use their freedom to create social change in such a way that the social change augments their freedom. It's not simply easily hijacked by some other superior freedom. And that this social change, however, always unfolds under conditions that are not of your own making. Hence, to understand the situation in which you act, you need to understand the situation you've inherited. But you've inherited from people who themselves acted in that situation. So in a way, the deeds of the dead are always kind of weighing on the brain of the present. And the brain of the present finds the past intelligible because of this element of deed or strategy that has been wrapped into it. So Sartre's view is that there is a distinctly human and distinctly historical way of acting, of moving forward, and that this way is powerful because it can unlock a number of fundamental common goods. And that if we're going to arise beyond our rather trapped situation that he outlines in his first book, and if we're going to find ways of having society, and that the society is not just going to be there because we can hide in it or shelter ourselves under authority, but because in fact we can act in it, we can in fact fulfill ourselves, become ourselves in it, then the projects in this society will all be necessarily unfolding within this dialectic. There will be a rationality to them, an understandability to them, which is dialectical, in other words, which which arises from their incompleteness, from their ambiguity, and from the context of conflict, from which necessarily forces us, conflict caused by scarcity, which forces all of us to act. So we are tied into this situation, hence it is existential, but at the same time it is historical and political. And we have to devise this action with very few clues and very few certainties. Now the reading which Patricia put up for you is Sartre's preliminary essay. It's his justification, his rationale for putting forward this idea of dialectical reason. And it's an extraordinary essay. It's a very readable essay. And I suggest that you all read it. I've deliberately skirted around the contents of his book in the hope that you'll be curious enough to go and read this very, very well, brilliantly written essay, which I think probably more than anything in these debates acts as an immediate guide to the present.